Good evening, everyone, and thank you for tuning in to hear the voice of Madame Twilight, reading you my favorite finds from budding and independent authors. Today, we dive into the world of myth and legend as we follow a young filmmaker discovering that there might just be something to a few of history's darker stories. If you're a fan of monsters and adventure, then buckle up, sweetheart. You're in for a ride. So sit back and enjoy the voice of Madame Twilight reading The Unnamed, Beast of the Cold Mountain. The Unnamed by Rebecca Johnson. Native Americans have been telling stories about predatory shapeshifters since before recorded history. The Blackfoot tell of the wolfman. The Navajo have naaldlooshii, the skinwalker. The Cherokee have a tribe that can reportedly change into bears, but they all share the same animalistic foundations. And the stories don't end there. Europeans brought over tales of werewolves. Cults of lycanthropy date back as far as 1200 BC. The French have the loup-garou, and ancient Mesoamericans have the nahual. And these are only to name a few. Yet humanity is still eager to dismiss these accounts as ones of fiction, lumping them all together within the obscure realms of myth and legend. This not only answers the impossibility of these creatures' existence, but also provides a desperate and necessary sense of security, being able to say, there's no such thing as monsters. Because there's not. Right? Chapter 1. The Contestants. Looks like they gave me a bang-up spot here, right by a great source of fish. This small clearing will give me a good 5-6 hours of sunlight. Yeah, this is going to be amazing. I can't wait. Carrie leaned back in her desk chair as Darren Henderson, the first wild contestant to be dropped off via chopper deep in the Montana Rockies, set his camera down on the pebbled lakeshore and executed a dramatic walk off-screen into the twisted woods. "Who's this one again?" her producer, Jim, asked. Carrie looked down to check her notes. "Darren Henderson, freelance survivalist." "Freelance? Look, you gave me the budget. I'm working with what I could find." Jim held up his hands, warding off any further effrontery. Carrie hadn't been immediately on board when he'd pitched his low-budget survival series idea to her, but he'd eventually talked her into it, citing this was the best way to break into the oversaturated film industry. As I was saying, he describes himself as a freelance survivalist, runs an independent woodscraft school out of his home in West Virginia, and claims to be an Eagle Scout, though he wasn't able to produce any credentials by the time we needed to start shooting. Says it'll be coming in the mail. Jim arched one eyebrow at her dry tone and cast an uneasy glance back at the now empty computer monitor. "I take it you're not holding out hopes of that making it into the credits?" "Hardly," she confirmed. But he signed the waiver. "Honestly, Jim, if you'd given me more than 50,000 prize money, I could have found you better contestants. 50 grand is nothing these days." She pursed her lips at the monitor, eyes searching. "Good Lord," she muttered. "I told them all to stay on screen. Stay on screen." Leaning forward, she fiddled with the mouse until another view popped up, a high vantage view of the entire camp that Carrie had fought hard for, showing Darren off in the far distance, just pulling his pants up over his bare ass. Jim snorted. "Well, can't fault a man for wanting a bit of privacy to do his business." "And if a bear or a mountain lion took interest in him doing his business, how would we know, And you said we wouldn't need the crow's nest." Jim gave her an exasperated sigh, and she turned, spinning her chair to face him. "You wanted me involved in this, Jim. Remember that. You wanted me because I know film, and I know the Rockies. Let me do my job." Jim drew back a bit at her tone, holding his hands up in surrender and causing Carrie to grimace. "Look, I'm sorry, but this guy especially makes me really nervous." Taking a frustrated sigh, she shook her head at the screen, tucking her short hair behind one ear. "There's only a few more weeks left of temperate weather. If we're lucky, he'll realize how hungry starvation feels and bow out quickly." "Uh-huh," Jim answered, nodding slowly. "So who else do we have?" Pulling her eyes away from the crow's nest cam, she passed over a manila folder. Zane Giller did 8 years in Air Force Special Operations, got out and joined local law enforcement in Chicago. After becoming disillusioned with the big city justice system, he picked up and moved his wife and 3 kids to a small town outside of Denver. Still in local law enforcement, but he also moonlights as a guide for some of the more adventurous tourists. Jim was nodding as he read along with Carrie's synopsis. Sounds like a decent guy. How about this Holly Helms? Seems a bit old. She's 56 and could probably wipe the floor with you, she retorted, making the corner of his mouth quirk up at the side. Holly Helms, mother of 6, lifelong pioneer woman from northern Idaho, lives mostly off-grid. She's my one to watch. If she can keep enough weight on her, she's winning this thing. That would make for a good pitch to the network, Jim mused, glancing down at the other contestants as Carrie worked to get Darren Henderson back on screen. This man is going to be a thorn in my side. Jim leaned in for a better view, then pointed down to the alert at the bottom of her screen. There, he's got his action cam on. Flip to head cam. Glancing down to where he was indicating, she flipped feeds, and the trundling image of greenery and forests lurched into view as the screen came up. Oh, he's going to make me seasick. I'm going to have to get someone else to watch this first-person stuff or I'm going to puke. Wait. And Jim looked over at her suddenly anxious tone. What's he doing? Volume. Where's the volume? Carrie's hand slapped across her keyboard until she found the volume button and Darren's voice rose from the speakers. But at least I know I'm not going to starve. Not for now, anyway. These red currants are going to be a great source of vitamin C, and Carrie's head was shaking in rapid jerks as Darren started plucking handfuls of bright red berries from a nearby shrub. No, 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 no. Jim, squawk him! Squawk him! Fumbling, Jim dove for the satellite radio on the desk next to him and shoved it into Carrie's waiting hands. Darren? Darren, stop! Can you hear me? Jim tipped his head as Carrie's voice, distorted with a slight delay, emanated through the speakers on the display monitor. Darren's motions hesitated, and the camera view dipped as he assumedly reached for his two-way. Sorry? Stop, Darren. Those aren't currants you're picking. Currants haven't been in season for months. Those are red baneberries. Eat those and we'll be medevacing you out by tonight. Baneberries, Darren muttered, dropping his handful to the forest floor and wiping his palm on his pants. Sorry, don't have those back home. Yes, you do. Then, after a rough sigh, she uttered back, Darren, do I need to pull you? No, came his immediate, tinny reply. No, baneberry. Got it. I'm good. You'd better be, Darren. Take a leaf. Memorize it. Stick it to your forehead if you need to, but if I see you trying to eat any more poisonous plants, I'm pulling you. Understand? Yeah, I got it. Leaning her forehead down against the heel of her hand holding the radio, she shook her head, but not before a low, bitch, drifted up from the video display. Jim quickly reached over and plucked the two-way from Carrie's tightening fingers just as she was lifting the device back to her lips. Scowling at him, she muttered, Thorn in my side. Then she took a deep sigh. One of the others getting dropped off. This guy's exhausting. Within the hour, Jim promised with an incriminating dimple in his chin. The rest of the crew should be here any minute. Should have been here already, she countered. I'm serious, Jim. I don't care if this is some independent venture run out of the back of a warehouse on crowd-funded money. These monitors better take this seriously. If I had looked away for 1 minute, my contestant would be dead. Make sure they know that. Don't worry, Carrie. I've got this. Chapter 2. The Rustler. Balancing 2 overloaded trays of coffee, Carrie shouldered open the back door of the dimly lit warehouse and slipped inside. Squinting against the lower light, she was relieved to find each monitor station double-staffed and attentive, the single row of fluorescent lights Jim allowed to stay lit, casting stark angles of drifting dust motes high over their heads. Nodding in satisfaction, she moved on past the row of lit monitors to the small office in the back, dropping off drink orders as she went. Lose anyone last night? She asked, not bothering to hide the cynicism in her voice. Sorry, Care, Jim announced with a wry grin. He's still in the running. Carrie rolled her eyes, knowing without needing to hear his name who Jim was talking about. Did see Darren lives to fight another day? Jim nodded, accepting a flat white from her. Though you missed the mini expose he did on the importance of knowing the difference between red currants and red baneberries this morning. Came across pretty believable. Carrie shook her head. God save me. Tossing the empty trays in the recycling bin, she took a sip of the black French roast remaining. Though we did have 2 call bug out this morning, he went on, voice hesitant. Carrie choked on her sip, looking up at him in disbelief. 2? He nodded, jerking his head to gesture her over to his monitor. One of the campers from Pennsylvania and the backwoods history teacher from Tennessee. Really? I had high hopes for the teacher. What weeded them out? Said they kept hearing voices in the night. Carrie blinked. Noises? It's the freaking Rocky Mountains. Of course there's going to be noises. What did they expect? Jim just shrugged. Dunno, but they both said the exact same thing when they called Bug out. Do you have the footage? Working on it. Then, after another couple of mouse clicks, an infrared image of John Keller, 43-year-old Tennessee mountain man and history teacher, popped into large screen view. The sound of crickets became loud as Jim adjusted the volume, and Carrie heard the low call of a great horned owl ghost out of the speakers. I just don't know. No, there it is again. Jim made some adjustments to the controls, and the sound of crickets grew louder. As John Keller went still and silent in the video, the rustling of brush joined the noises of the night insects. Carrie wrinkled her brow, tipping her head as she listened. Whatever it is, it's big, Keller went on, voice barely above a whisper as he held his camera close to his face. But what worries me ain't that. Another pause as the rustling grew closer, the rhythm of the movement leaving no question that it was something big walking around. Carrie frowned deeper as she listened. Silence fell over the small room as whatever was walking around outside of John Keller's shelter came to a thudding halt, seemingly right next to his head by the mountain man's wide-eyed expression. A sheen of sweat was visible across his forehead. Then, after a pregnant pause, the creature stepped away again, but something sounded wrong. The rhythm was wrong. Keller took a deep breath, blinking and raising his brows as the sound disappeared. No, I've been in the hills all my life. Big don't bother me. And he shook his head, still staring at the wall of his flimsy shelter. What bothers me is that sucker weren't on 4 legs. Carrie felt a chill race from tip to toe at his words, her own mind confirming the burly mountain man's assessment. Trail cams? Jim nodded. I started them uploading, but they're remote. It's going to take a bit. Absently she nodded, still replaying the heavy, even, 2-part thumping of the night creature walking around Keller's tent. What about the other? Frowning, Jim leaned in and flipped over to another camera. Waiting, Carrie listened as the extreme camper from Pennsylvania cowered against the exact same noises. Disturbing footfalls of a heavy 2-beat gait. They both said the same thing on Bug Out this morning, Jim explained. The wrestlers came 5 or 6 times in the night, at one point even going so far as to jostle Keller's shelter. Unnerved them both so bad they dialed out at first light. Carrie was steadily shaking her head. What on earth? Jim, I want to see those trail cams as soon as they're uploaded. But a clamor from the other room cut off her words. Straightening, she turned to face the wide safety glass window just as one of the viewers jogged to a halt outside the small office. Not bothering to knock, he swung the door in. We've got a warm body on screen. Chapter 3. The Shaman. Jim stood up out of his seat. You what? But the viewer just nodded. Just walked right on in. Looks like a native. A native? Carrie blurted, making for the door. We're 100 miles away from the nearest reservation. How the hell? Pushing the other viewer to the side as she reached the offending station, she sat down in front of the screen and slipped the headset over her ears. Darren Henderson's voice joined the first-person headcam view of an old, weathered-faced man with copper-russet skin and broad features. Carrie squinted at the image jerking in and out of view as Darren shook his head and looked around. Where's the squawk? The viewer who had come to fetch them slapped the radio into Carrie's open hand, and she raised it to her mouth, holding down the speak button. Darren, can you hear me? A small burst of static announced her releasing the button, and she muttered, Come on, please, Darren, tell me you're wearing the squawk. Nothing happened, and she pressed the button again. Darren, pick up! Oh, for God's sake! And she hit the red emergency alarm button on the radio's face. The strident tone reached her ears through the headset, and she breathed a short sigh. The camera view ducked as Darren searched for his end, and suddenly the radio hissed, and he answered. Flicking one of the earpieces off, Carrie mashed hard on the radio button. Darren, it's Carrie. I need you to take off your headcam and hold it in your hand. Here? Hold it in your hand so I can see. Darren didn't answer, but there was a brief clatter of feedback before the headcam jostled and reoriented facing the unexpected visitor. He looked like an image out of a history book. Most of the locals down at the reservation wore the average American wardrobe, but this man, taking up center screen in Darren's view, was dressed in skins, fringed and furred, complete with beaded hems and hide boots. A 3-stranded bone and claw necklace hung from his neck, and his hair was braided and bound on either side of his head with leather wraps. The colors and adornments decorating his person were suggestive of a medicine man or some kind of spiritual leader, but some of the symbols inked into his leather sleeves were clearly Sanskrit. Maybe the North American version of a shaman? "Jim," Carrie hissed, "there's not supposed to be anyone out there. Uninhabited, you said. No one for miles." Jim was gritting his teeth when she looked up at him. "Jim, I had to improvise." "Improvise? We had a budget." "James Harper, if you've gone and—" But she cut off as the tribesman began to speak. He was speaking English, but his words were hesitant and heavily accented. Carrie frowned as she watched the screen, but his expansive hand gestures waving Darren away left little need to interpret what he was saying. Darren took a step back, and the image jostled. Carrie squinted harder, leaning toward the monitor, shaking her head as she picked out one or two of his thick words. Spiritland. Go away. Hunting? She jumped when Jim's hand suddenly snatched the two-way from her sweaty fingers. "Darren, it's Jim. Point me at this guy." The sound of plastic rattling came through the speakers, and then Darren's radio floated into view. Jim stood, taking the two-way with him as he walked back toward the office. "This is Jim Harper, executive producer of Wild." Then the door to the office closed. Turning back to the screen, Carrie fumbled both earpieces back into place and turned the volume on the system up. The sound was distorted, but she could just make out Jim's voice coming from the radio held in Darren's hand, still calling out to the unnamed tribesman. Slowly, he approached, stepping hesitantly toward Darren and reaching out to take the radio. Darren made a show of pointing to the speak button and then handed it over. Straining her ears, Carrie tried to pick through the argument playing out before her.
"Thought we had an agreement."
"No, cannot stay."
"Not what we discussed."
"Things not decided."
"Oh, yes, they were decided."
"Not all told."
"Tribe will be paid in full."
But then the tribesmen and radio were too far away to make out any more. "Jim, what have you gotten us into?" she muttered under her breath. Turning in her seat, she craned her neck to see through the window to the office. Jim was there, making wild hand gestures as he spoke into the radio, facial expressions making it clear that he was over-enunciating his words and speaking loudly. "Jim Harper, you are an absolute ass." Pressing her lips together in a tight line, she looked back to the screen. The tribesman was facing away from them, listening to whatever it was that Jim was saying. But then he stiffened, turning to look down at the little two-way in his hand. Carrie's brows drew together as she watched the hide-clad native stride back over to Darren and hold the radio stiffly out in front of him. He was too close for Carrie to see his face in the video feed, but she could tell he was staring at Darren's face. "Leave. Now. While you can." His voice was clear as crystal through the camera's microphone, and his words sent a chill racing through Carrie's gut. Then, braids bobbing once as he nodded, he turned and walked away up the rocky landscape. Jim's distorted voice joined the feed again.
"Don't worry, Darren. It's been handled. You're good."
"Yeah? Then what's all this about leaving while I can? I'm not going to get scalped in my sleep or anything, am I?" Carrie rolled her eyes. Asshat. This isn't a Wild West movie. But Jim's answering voice jolted her out of her disgust.
"Nah, man, you're good. Just ghost stories and native legend. I've got an arrangement with the tribe. No one's going to bother you."
Fuming, Carrie ripped the headset from her ears and marched off in the direction of the office. Chapter 4. The Arrangement. "You have an arrangement?" Carrie blurted as she slammed the door closed behind her. "Let it go, Care." "No, you don't get to care me this time. Tell me what's going on." "I told you, we had a small budget. You wanted choppers? I had to find a way to pay the pilots. You wanted 24/7 on-call emergency physicians. I had to pay for that too. Do you have any idea what production costs are in the U.S.? I was able to slash our overhead by filming on a reservation. The tribe is primitive, tucked away, pretty much invisible even to the U.S. government. They don't have access to modern health care, food supplies, technology, anything. And so you exploited them for a cheap filming location? Jim, honestly, if they're still primitive in this day and age, it's because they worked really hard to stay that way." Regardless, the tribe's leaders agreed to let me film there, all for the price of some medicine and supplies. We send contestants in, leaving as little footprint as possible, and the tribe allows for their presence with no interference. At the end of the competition, we chopper in a year's worth of non-perishable food and first aid. Carrie made a sharp gesture to the filming station in the other room. Clearly, that's not the case. What was that man saying? Not all of them had been told? Wasn't he just out there trying to run off one of our contestants? Like I said, it's been handled. Carrie could tell Jim was getting defensive because the rims of his ears were turning red, but she didn't care. She was livid. Handled? You mean you're holding food and aid over these people's heads and asking them to comply with something they're clearly not comfortable with? Yeah, well, what's done is done. If we pull the plug now, that's $1.5 million down the drain. Are you willing to waste that? Willing to throw your dream of having your own nature documentary in the crapper? Carrie jammed one fist against her hip as she threw him a level look. I have a double PhD in biology and anthropology. Film was a side interest, a hobby, an elective to get me to graduation. You think I can't survive without this series? Regardless, the show is happening with or without you at this point. Then, at Carrie's bunching jaw, he relented with a sigh. But I would much rather have you with us. Carrie took a deep, long breath. Tell me everything. Jim just shrugged. That was about it. I got the idea early on to ask on the reservations. That's how I heard about these guys. He made an illustrative motion out toward the other room. There's some unknown blend of the Salish groups that inhabited the northernmost Rockies. The other tribes always gave them a wide berth, apparently, because of their purported history of guarding sacred grounds. They seemed amenable enough when I made them the offer, though, as long as I didn't disclose their location publicly. Carrie folded her arms across her chest. Sacred grounds? Is that what you were talking about with ghost stories and native legends? Jim nodded, leaning back against the edge of the desk. There's supposedly a sacred cave or something somewhere in the middle of the reservation. They take it as their tribal duty, or whatever, to guard it. And they're willing to forsake this tribal duty for the price of some Band-Aids and bagged chips? Jim bit at the inside of his mouth. They're not doing that well, he admitted. The flu or something made it up to them the past 2 years, and the fish and game aren't what they used to be. They needed the help, so don't think I just bribed them with it. Carrie furrowed her brows at this news. After a moment of silent battling inside her head, she said, Fine. I'll stay, but only if you pay them what they're owed now. Jim dropped his head and let out a breath. Then he nodded. Deal. And good stuff, too. No Debbie cakes or Slim Jims. Montana has a whole slew of meat processors. You give them dried meats, home-preserved foods, dried grains and rice. Nothing that's going to send them into a diabetic coma. And send someone to give them flu vaccines if they want it. I don't think you realize how much these people opened up to you if they let you do this. She swept her arm around to the warehouse at large. On their sacred land. You owe them. Jim grimaced and rolled his head back, as if calculating the extra cost. Those are my terms, Jim. Finally, he let his head drop down. Fine. I'll figure it out and have it delivered as soon as I can. Good, she answered. And you're sure the contestants are safe? He nodded. I have it in writing. No one from the tribe will set foot into a contestant's camp, and no contestant will set foot in the tribe's village. I had to remind our friend out there of our arrangement, but he agreed to abide by it. Was it the intrusion that bothered him? Carrie asked, a sympathetic wrinkle coming to her brow. Jim shook his head. No, actually, he was worried about Darren. Carrie looked up. What? Jim nodded. He said the spirits or something wouldn't allow for his presence for long, and that Darren was in danger from the mountain if he stayed. From the mountain? Carrie echoed, frown deepening, but Jim waved away her concern. I heard it all from the people down on the res. Bunch of ghost stories and legends about monsters. Not even they took it too seriously. Slowly, Carrie nodded. Right. Well, at least now we know what scared off the other two. Or who, rather. Lifting his brows in agreement, Jim twisted to face his screen. Still want to wait on the trail cam upload? No need, she answered. We've got bigger fish to fry right now. Trail cam footage can wait till the cutting room. Then she took a deep breath, rubbing both hands over her face. Ugh, why do things have to be so complicated? Because it's a full moon tonight? Jim replied with a short laugh. Carrie gave him a humorless grunt in return. Nice try. Full moon was last night. Chapter 5. 4 weeks in. All right, place your bets. The call for wagers rang out over the viewing room, and Carrie snorted, stomping the snow from her boots as she let the back door swing closed behind her. First medical field check was being sent out today, and anyone who dipped below the allotted weight loss percentage would be sent packing. Carrie privately hoped it would be Darren, but thought it would be unprofessional of her to start placing bets in front of the staff. 2 more had dropped out since the first ones had been scared off by the shaman, leaving Holly Helms, homesteader, Todd Sawyer, extreme backpacker, and, of course, Darren. Bumping open the door to the office with a hip, Carrie maneuvered her way in and set the full drink holder on the desk. Jim took an automatic inhale through his nose. I love Fridays. Fridays are fat days, Carrie agreed, plopping the last box of donut holes on the desk between them before taking a seat. Medboat made it there yet? No, Jim replied as he wrestled with the flaps on the grease-stained box. Scheduled to arrive any minute, though. Any wagers? Carrie gave him the type of loaded look she usually reserved for her siblings before leaning forward and popping open the top of the donut box. Jim snorted in response. Not bad. The man was ankle-deep in snow and worried he was going to dehydrate because the lake was starting to freeze. I mean, I've known some flakes in my time, but really? Jim popped a bite of deep-fried dough into his mouth and grinned. Well, you might just get your wish. Your Darren hasn't caught a fish or bagged a rabbit in nearly 2 weeks. Bet those baneberries are looking pretty good right now. Please, she begged, don't call him my Darren. Jim laughed, clearly at her expense, but then a flash of his eyes toward his screen told her Medboat had just come online. They were approaching the first contestant. Who's first? Holly, he answered. But she's been doing fine. She's really got the small game trails mapped. Not surprising. She's pretty much been doing this her whole life. Give it a bit longer and the bighorns will be in her area. She'll have this thing in the bag. I don't know, Jim hedged, challenging lilt to his voice. Todd's been doing pretty well. Carrie leaned forward and plucked one of the donut holes from the box. A wager, then? Then she popped it into her mouth. Jim gave her a sidelong glance. You're on. Holly did well, Carrie was pleased to watch, not only maintaining sufficient body mass to continue the show, but also displaying her stocks of smoked fish and rabbit meat for the competition ahead. Without hesitation, Dr. Gillis, the physician contracted with Medboat, determined her fit to continue. Todd, while not nearly as well provisioned as Holly, still managed to maintain sufficient vitals and body weight to continue. And then there was Darren. Carrie reached for another donut hole and popped it eagerly into her mouth. Jim flicked his eyes toward her. Never seen you so keen to see someone fail before. Not to see him fail, she allowed. To catch him in a lie. Jim stared at her a moment longer, then took a breath. You heard back from Boy Scouts of America. Sure did, she answered. Want to know what they said? No, I most certainly don't, he answered without question, then turned back to the screen. Here, there he is. Medboat was pulling up to the small lakeside beach by Darren's camp, chunks of broken ice parting across its bow. Darren stood waiting on the shoreline, arm upraised in greeting. 4 weeks' worth of growth shielded his face beneath his hat and scarf, and he quickly tucked his hand back into the shelter of his armpit as the boat scuffed up onto the shore. Moment of truth, Carrie muttered as Dr. Gillis stepped out of the boat and began speaking with him. Moments passed as Darren had his temperature and blood pressure taken, heart and lungs auscultated, vision and reflexes checked, and then finally they had him stripped down to his pants and socks and step up on the scale. Carrie hesitated in the motion of bringing her coffee to her lips. Good God, I can count his ribs from here, she thought. She caught the motion of Jim stealing a glance at her face, but she couldn't look away. Darren's pants hung loose around protruding hip bones, and the apexes of his shoulders were sharp and startling. What she had first thought were just deep shadows caught between his beard and hat now became evident as heavy, dark circles beneath his eyes. Shit, she breathed. No way he's staying, Jim echoed, his voice coming out in the same disturbed whisper as her own. The sound of clicking keys reached them as Darren's data was entered into the system, and then the doctor looked up at him. Darren, you are dangerously close to reaching critical body fat loss. You're almost to the point where we need to consider damage to your heart and vital organs. Almost, Darren answered quickly. But not there, right? I'm still in? Dr. Gillis took a deep breath, but gave a non-committal nod. It would make me feel a lot better if you chose to bow out and came with us for some nutritional rehab, but yes, officially you are still in. Carrie let out a loud groan and let her head sink to her hands. Sorry, Care, Jim offered, taking one last donut hole. Better luck next time. He's determined to kill himself out here one way or another, she complained, tipping her head partially up to peer between her fingers. I want the next medboat sent out in 1 week. If we're lucky, we can fit another one in before the lake freezes solid and we have to switch to chopper. Jim nodded, not even bothering to complain about the added cost. Think he'll last that long? I've a feeling this one would starve to death before bugging out. 1 week is enough to tip him over the edge without doing him any long-term harm. Rapping her knuckles against the desk a few times in thought, she finally rose to move to her own station. "I'll compile Dr. Gillis's notes. You good?" "Good," he answered, toasting her with his cup of coffee. "Thanks." "What do you mean we've lost Darren?" Carrie blurted in response to Jim's pseudo-greeting as she entered the warehouse the next morning. "Not him," Jim allowed. "Just his feed." Carrie dropped her bag by the door and rushed over to Darren's monitoring station, his two viewers and Jim working in unison to fix whatever interruption had cut visual to Darren's cameras. "How? Everything was fine during field check yesterday. What happened?" One of Darren's viewers, Amanda, turned to her, hands on her hips. "We don't know. He was monologuing to his headcam around 3 a.m., talking about something walking around his camp. He thought it might be an elk, so he bundled up and headed out of his shelter to look around." "He what?" she interrupted, staring dumbfounded at the young woman, who shrugged with a "don't blame the messenger" face. Carrie took a quick breath. "Well, what did you see?" Amanda's immediate eye roll turned into a worried frown. "He didn't take headcam with him, or the squawk. Crow's Nest didn't pick up anything in the immediate camp, but we saw Darren leave his shelter and move off into the woods with a flashlight. About 15 minutes later, his feed died. And we haven't been able to get it back up," Jim confirmed with finality. Then he leaned back with a sigh. "It's his on-site data link. It's gotta be. That's the only way we'd lose Crow's Nest, headcam, trail, and squawk all at once." Carrie grimaced. "In other words, it's nothing we can fix remotely, and he's been without adult supervision for..." She looked down at her watch. "4 hours?" "Near enough. I just called Dr. Gillis. I'm sending him and Tech up there just as soon as the doc can make it in." "I'm going too," Carrie said, striding back over to her bag and sending a quick text to her roommate. Jim cocked an eyebrow at her. "I don't think jeans and a Patagonia jacket are going to cut it at the higher elevations." "We live in Montana, Jim. I keep a parka in my truck in July. I'm ready to go just as soon as the doctor gets here." Shaking his head in surrender, Jim turned back to the monitor station. "Your call." Carrie pressed her lips tight. Yes, it was. And she had a thing or two she wanted to say to Darren about walking out into the forest at night. Thorn in my side. Chapter 6. The Well Check. Carrie ducked beneath the swirling chopper blades as she, Dr. Gillis, and Josh from Tech scurried toward the boat waiting for them on the pebbled shore, motor purring and ready, one of the bug-out crew at the helm. Bug-out was stationed about a mile away from Darren's camp, on the other side of the large mountain lake. Revving into motion, Carrie turned her face away from the biting wind as the boat jetted across the surface, its passage disturbing the placid blue waters and silence of the surrounding peaks. Finally, the boat skidded up to Darren's camp. Carrie recognized the ramshackle teepee-style shelter and oversized fire pit from regular viewing of his crow's nest cam, but Darren was nowhere in sight. Carrie's stomach gave an uncomfortable twist. Surely he'd heard the boat coming. The chopper, too, for that matter. Yesterday he'd met Medboat with time to spare. "Josh, you know where the tower is?" Josh nodded, gesturing off to the east end of camp. "Yeah, I'm good. You guys go ahead." Jerking her head toward Dr. Gillis, Carrie motioned for him to follow. She had watched the crow's nest footage of Darren leaving camp, and she hurried over in the direction he'd left early that morning before dawn. Reaching the edge of the clearing, she paused, looking down. She searched the area until Darren's trail popped out of the surrounding landscape. A turned stone here, a scuffed patch of moss there. Finally, a partial boot print in some soft earth had her squatting down to investigate. "Darren!" she called out, lifting her head from the tracks and scanning the surrounding trees. No answer. "Shit," she muttered, reaching in her pocket and slipping the spare headcam over her brow. "Josh did say the mobile data link will get me to Jim, right?" Dr. Gillis, standing a few feet back from where she was crouched, nodded, eyes scanning the woods as well. Slipping the earpiece over the rim of her right ear, she clicked it on, then the camera. "All right, well, moment of truth." Nothing happened for a moment. Then a series of beeps became audible, a click of feedback, then...
"Care, you there?"
Carrie breathed a sigh of relief. "I'm here. Eyes and ears?"
"Both,"
Jim's voice confirmed after a short delay.
"You're live."
"All right, we're live," she announced for the doctor's sake. "Let's see what Darren's gone and gotten himself into." She followed his trail out into the snow-dusted vegetation. New flurries had fallen again last night, replacing the melt from the heavier fall that had come a couple of weeks ago. Her boots made a familiar soft crunch with each step, the sound of the idling boat disappearing in the snow-muffled branches of the densely wooded copse. Thwack. Carrie stilled, holding a cautionary hand up to Dr. Gillis trudging along in her wake. Thwack.
What do you hear, Care?
Orienting to the north, she heard the distinctive sound of an axe falling again. Sounds like someone chopping wood. "Darren!" she called again. No answer, just another heavy blow echoing through the trees. Shaking her head, she oriented on the sound and pushed forward. She finally caught a shadow of movement through the trees and hurried to push through the low-growing conifers to the sight of Darren, shirtless amid the snow, wiry back glistening with a sheen of sweat as he swung his axe in an effortless arc down to cleave a fat log in two. His body is starving and he's wasting the energy splitting logs? "Darren!" she called out, pushing her way into the small clearing. "What the hell? Didn't you hear us calling?" Jim's voice crackled in her ear.
Well, he seems fine.
Carrie knew what he meant. Darren stood strong and upright, not the shrunken, shivering, cadaverous specimen they had witnessed just yesterday. Had it all been for show? The axe head drifted down to Darren's side, but he didn't turn. He simply lifted his head and took a deep breath through his nose.
"Did I win?"
Carrie hesitated. His voice sounded much different than it normally did on camera. Rough, gravelly, and much deeper than when she'd first met him via video chat from West Virginia. No. Then she shook her head, collecting herself. "Your tech is screwing up. Didn't you notice your connection was down?" She made a motion with her arm toward his handheld, wedged in the fork of a tree, its network indicator flashing a bright red.
"Nope,"
came his casual answer as he bent to place another log on the chopping block. Grinding her teeth, Carrie moved to step around in front of him, jumping back when he didn't abort his swing. Freaking asshat. "Your feed went down early this morning, right after you left your shelter to investigate night noises without your camera," she fumed, stressing each word. "What were you thinking? You know the competition rules. Go nowhere unmonitored. What part of nowhere translated into nightscapades? You could have—" But she cut off as he turned to face her fully, and she saw the long smear of blood traveling from cheek to chest.
Holy shit.
Jim's voice was a distant echo in her ear. "Jesus, Darren. What happened?" She had to stop herself from reaching up and taking his chin in her hand, balking at the predatory look in his eyes when she moved closer.
"Nightscapades earned me a hair. Didn't bother to cook it."
Blinking, Carrie spared a glance at Dr. Gillis, who was taking in Darren's upright stature and improved figure with open disbelief. That's how you get parasites, Darren," she ventured on, voice losing some of its bravado in the wake of his strange behavior. "You know better." He took a step toward her, much closer than she was comfortable with, his gaze locking on her eyes as his height eclipsed hers.
"Hunger will do funny things to a man."
Carrie felt her breath catch at the look in his eyes, and she suddenly felt very much like a hare herself.
Carrie, I want you out of there. This guy's not acting right.
Carrie was already having the same thought, but when she moved a step away, Darren's nostrils flared and he mirrored her motion. Suddenly, Dr. Gillis was at her side, clapping Darren sharply on the wiry meat of his shoulder. "Congratulations on your catch, son. That hair might be the difference in you winning this thing." Darren seemed to blink himself out of some sort of fog as he looked down at the doctor.
"Winning."
"And it looks as if Josh has got your tower up and running again," Doc went on, tipping his head toward Darren's camera, now glowing a bright, steady green. Darren turned to follow his gaze, and when he turned away, Dr. Gillis took a sideways step, placing himself firmly between her and Darren. Carrie took advantage of the opportunity and backed up a pace while Darren was occupied. "Now," the doc went on, voice low and calm, "do you think you need to accompany us to the boat for a vitals check, or do you feel fit to continue as is?"
"I'm fit,"
came Darren's immediate answer.
"Yes, that certainly seems the case. All righty. Well, we'll leave you to your task then. Only 2 others remain, you know. You're well on your way to winning this."
Carrie cast the doctor an incredulous glance. He shouldn't be telling a contestant that. But when Dr. Gillis's hand came up behind his back and began waving her away, she suddenly took his meaning.
"Now, why don't you take a moment to tell your viewers there was a break in your recording? We'll get out of here so it doesn't look like you've had any interference in your stay."
Without looking back, Darren moved off to the camera resting in the trees. Slowly, but with an increasing need to run, Carrie backed out of the small clearing, Dr. Gillis holding his position, blocking Darren's line of sight with her. Once safely in the shelter of the trees, Carrie turned and began marching swiftly back in the direction of the boat. "What was going on back there, Doc?" she asked, her anxiety causing her voice to quaver a bit.
The doctor didn't immediately reply, just shuffled through the snow with a rapid step, keeping easy pace with her now, where he'd had trouble matching her stride on the way in. Finally, he asked, "Did you happen to do background checks on your contestants before putting them out here?" Carrie shot him a glance, relaxing a bit when the sound of axe fall rose behind them. "No? Why?" Dr. Gillis shook his head. "Isolation can do strange things to the human psyche. Delusions, mental impairment, thoughts of hopelessness. That, coupled with starvation and the knowledge that he had likely failed in his ambition, doubtless put Darren in a pretty dark place last night. But a blast of protein and red meat flowing in his veins, the thrill of a successful hunt, that will also do strange things to the mind." "Strange how?" Dr. Gillis gave an uncomfortable little shrug. "I've seen that look in men before. Bad men, psych cases. But psych is all about chemical imbalance. Darren is not only dealing with nearly 30 days of extreme isolation, but his body is burning through its own fat and possibly muscle for energy. That's going to cause all sorts of mess with the neurotransmitters floating around through his brain, destabilizing his mood, impairing his thinking. Now, toss a fat rabbit into that mix, and I'll bet Darren is feeling downright primitive. His body is burning through that hair like yours would a cup of sugared espresso. His mood is lifted, his energy is spiking. Likely experiencing a spike in libido?" he added, casting a meaningful look in her direction.
Jesus Christ.
But Carrie ignored Jim's whispered remark, giving the doctor a horrified look. "All I'm saying is, we didn't need to be hanging around in that clearing with him any longer. As I've said, I've seen that look before, and you, my dear, were prey." Chapter 7. The Blind Spot. Carrie examined the battered piece of electronics in her hands, mind drifting between her present conundrum and her morning spent up on site. Josh hadn't been able to repair the downed data link in Darren's camp, choosing instead just to replace it, and upon examination, Carrie had no questions as to why. The entire section responsible for maintaining Darren's remote network had been battered beyond repair. Josh had hypothesized damage from a falling limb, but he hadn't been able to produce any physical evidence of such an occurrence, and Carrie hadn't been keen on sticking around to investigate further. For her own part, Carrie thought the damage looked more biologic in nature, antler rubbing or similar, judging by the long grooves covering the equipment. But the tower was situated in a rare blind spot created by Darren's shelter in the edge of the woods, so there was no way to be sure. Tossing the mangled remnants to the corner of her desk, she sighed. Josh had said he'd likely be able to retrieve the data, but she wasn't optimistic. Darren had left his headcam behind anyway. The most they'd get from digging out the footage would be the trail camps surrounding his base camp. Thinking back to her disturbing encounter in the clearing, she fiddled with her mouse until Darren's feed came up. He was sleeping. Maybe his body finally burned through that bunny rush, she thought darkly. The more her mind drifted back to his disquieting behavior, the frightening way his eyes had fixed on her, the way he'd made her want to tuck tail and run into the trees, the more she wanted to climb back up that mountain and kick him in the balls. But of course, there was no hint of that predatory edge now. Hat pulled down over his eyes, body bundled against the cold as he slept. Carrie clicked the screen over to Crow's Nest. She'd have the team adjust the perspective next field check, though if she were lucky, Darren would simply weigh out and be sent home. That would not only solve the problem of the camera angle, but also get him back on the other side of the country, away from her. And after this morning, she couldn't be rid of the man quick enough. Thumping her elbows down on the desk, she ran her fingers back through her short, hat-tousled hair. "You gonna make it over there?" Carrie would have been annoyed, but Jim had been very attentive since she arrived back down from the mountain, having witnessed the entire incident firsthand through her headcam. He knew she was shaken, and she hated it. "I'm fine," she grumbled, not lifting her head from her hands. Jim's chair creaked as he leaned away from his desk and spun toward her. "Really, Care, why don't you just go home? Call it a night. Go home, fix yourself a drink, and try to get some sleep." Rotating her head until she could see him from beneath the cover of her scrunched fingers, she finally puffed out a breath. "Fine, but call me if anything else happens. I don't want to be taken by surprise in the morning again." "I promise. Just please go." Snorting softly, she rose to leave. The sound of her phone buzzing jolted her awake. Blinking in the dark, Carrie flopped out a hand until she felt the vibration beneath her fingers. Sweeping it up to squint at the name on the screen, she flicked open the call. "This is Carrie," she rasped. sleep making her voice thick and groggy.
Hi, this is Jackson. I'm on Darren's night shift. Mr. Harper left instructions that we were to tell you if anything came up, so, yeah. Darren's missing.
He's what? Carrie answered, voice becoming stronger as a buzz of adrenaline dove through her middle.
Not like missing,
Jackson hurried to amend.
It's just, he left his shelter a while back without his infrared, and he hasn't come back.
Carrie took a minute to gather her scattered thoughts. Looking down at the time on her phone, she saw it was barely 3 a.m. How long has he been off screen?
About 45 minutes.
Damn it. Damn you, Darren, and your freaking nightscapades. How did he seem when he left? She asked, rubbing a hand over her brow in agitation.
Fine, I suppose. Just got up and walked out. Didn't mention hearing anything or say where he was going, just got up and left.
Carrie took a deep breath, remembering what he had said the morning prior.
My nightscapades earned me a hair.
He's probably trying to get lucky hunting again, she reasoned, forcing down the wave of irritation before she took her anger out on poor Jackson. Look, we can't send Bug out until daylight. Keep an eye out for him and just send me a text when he comes back. My bet is he's just fine. If he's not back by sunup, send the boat. Jim showed up about 7:45, a cold rush of air announcing his arrival into the viewing room. Hurrying to close the door behind him, he shook off his coat and hung it on the long rack against the wall. Find him? He called as Carrie motioned to him from Darren's monitor station. She had texted him just as soon as she'd hung up with Jackson. Yes, she answered, then continued under her breath. More's the pity. A soft snort from one of the viewers made her reevaluate her subtlety, and she straightened. He showed up about an hour before dawn. No explanation, no monologue, just waltzed back into camp and went back to sleep.
Well, that's good then, right? Why do you look so upset?
I'm upset because I have no idea where he went. He slipped out of his shelter and into the woods without once being seen on Crow's Nest. It's that damn blind spot. We've got to fix it. I watched him get up and leave, Jim. For all I know, he could have been sleepwalking. I've got to have full eyes on his camp, and his Crow's Nest cam needs to be replaced with an infrared. Jim nodded, staring at the replayed image of Darren ducking back into his shelter and crawling in bed. I'll send the team up with field check in a few days. Which reminds me, supply is ready for the tribe. It'll be going up then, too. Carrie felt a lightening of the heavy feeling she'd been carrying around since yesterday. Good. I'll feel better knowing that's taken care of. One less thing to worry about. Chapter 8. The Footage.
All right, chopper's back. 1 hour until supply send-off,
Jim called out over the room of chattering viewers.
We've got field check in 5, so make sure you have the remote network linked on your stations.
Murmurs of assent echoed back from around the warehouse, and Jim nodded over at Carrie from the doorway to the office.
Your camera team all check in?
She nodded, pressing send on a final text to the chopper pilot. All ready to ride out with Dr. Gillis. I'll monitor the view from here. Jim lifted an eyebrow at her but nodded. She didn't respond to the look, but could tell what he was thinking. Normally she'd be up there making the adjustments herself, making sure it was done right the first time. But when it had come time to assemble the team that would go back up the mountain, Carrie just hadn't been able to bring herself to willingly re-enter Darren's camp. And she had made a point to assemble an all-male team. She could see an awkward question brewing in Jim's face, but she was saved from unwelcome interrogation when Josh from Tech came skidding into view past the large window, hair windblown and color high in his cheeks. Carrie lifted her brows as he drew up short, missing colliding with Jim by inches. Nodding quickly in apology, he shot an eager glance over at Carrie, and then shuffled into the office. "I've got your footage," he announced, sounding breathless and clearly excited. Shaking his head, Jim lifted his chin in Carrie's direction. "You good?" She waved him away. "I'll let you know when they get there." Nodding, he turned and made his way out into the viewing room, door swinging closed behind him. Carrie turned her attention to Josh. "And?" "You're about to see something wild," he nearly gushed. Carrie blinked. She'd never seen Josh so excited before. Wordlessly, she rolled away from her desk, motioning for him to take the helm. Biting his bottom lip between his teeth, he rushed into the empty space, jamming a flash drive into the port.
"We're live at Darren in 2 minutes if you want to bring up remote,"
came Jim's voice through the speaker on her desk phone. "Got it," she answered, pushing off and rolling over to Jim's desk. Pulling up Dr. Gillis's feed, she took in a view of the lake rushing by, and the sound of an outboard motor filled the small room. She'd been waiting all week for this. Darren hadn't caught a fish or snared any game in nearly 8 days. No way he was making it through this way in. Josh's mouse clicks were growing frenzied, and Carrie rolled back over to her own desk, watching the scrub of video feed flying by on her screen. With a definitive smack of the mouse button, the picture stopped. Carrie blinked, shaking her head. "Josh, this is Holly's camp." Josh nodded, not seeming put off by her observation. "I know, just watch." Lifting her brows, she looked back to the screen, the infrared image of a lynx crossing in front of the trail cam, eyes glowing.
"Darren, you're looking well."
Carrie glanced over at the other monitor to see Dr. Gillis's camera view approaching Darren with casual steps. He was bundled in all his winter wear again, eyes and bearded face just visible between his hat and thick scarf. "All right," Josh announced, bringing her attention back around. "Now this one." Carrie watched as a wolf snuffled around the camera, its fur a dark negative of the colors it would normally be in the daylight, eyes reflecting the invisible spectrum of the trail cam in bright flashes.
"Heart sounds good. Strong pulse. Good. Go ahead and take a few deep breaths for me."
She tried to steal another look over at Darren, but Josh made another loud click. Holly's face ghosted into view, her dark hair showing bright and pale in the night vision view, features content, watching the woods as the blacks of her pupils winked a soft green in the light from her fire. "Josh, I really don't—"
"All right then, Darren. Why don't you go ahead and unbundle and step up on the scale? We'll do this part quickly so you can warm back up."
"Now look at this." Carrie turned back, finally recognizing Darren's camp in the pale green glow of trail cam footage. He was just walking back into the camp, eyes on the ground as he stepped through the trees. Something rustled in the brush beside the camera, and Darren's head whipped around, eyes gleaming an incandescent white. "Holy shit," Carrie breathed, then jerked away from the screen as Darren sprinted across the clearing toward the camera. Carrie heard the terrified squeal of a small animal, followed by the squelching of flesh and popping of bone. All the hair on her body stood up on end, and cold prickles raced across her cheeks as the blood drained from her face. "What the hell?"
"Well, you're certainly doing better than last time we saw you, it seems. Go ahead, step on up."
Carrie spun at the confused note to Dr. Gillis's voice. Darren stood a few feet away from him, muscles lean and full across his chest and abdomen, shoulders back, spine erect. Scrambling over to the other desk, Carrie fumbled to turn the volume up. The doctor didn't speak, though. A silent moment passed as Dr. Gillis stared down at the digital reading at Darren's feet, Carrie staring with him. 68.9 kilograms. Not looking away from the screen, Carrie's hand darted out and started searching drawers for Jim's calculator. 68.9, 2.2. Shit, no. What was he last time? Remembering, she punched in the kilograms and converted it out again. 8 pounds. A wave of ice clenched at Carrie's gut. "What?" Josh questioned, voice hesitant. "Darren's gained 8 pounds since last weigh-in," she breathed, her rational mind fighting against what her eyes were seeing. She stared at the video feed in front of her, Dr. Gillis still oriented on the scale, clearly confused at this change in trend from his previous visit. Shoving herself away from the desk, she stood, pointing a trembling finger at Josh. "I want all the trail cam footage. Everyone's. Starting from when the first 2 contestants bugged out." She brought her fingertips to her face, feeling them shake against her lips as her mind struggled to keep up with the raging incongruity of practical, grounded reasoning and Darren. "I want the entire technical team reviewing them, immediately. I don't care what Jim says about the cost." Then, suddenly thinking of Jim, she jerked her eyes down at her watch. "Jim," she called, dashing through the door of the office and racing toward the exit. "Tell the pilot to wait. I'm going up with the supplies." Jim's head lifted from where he was bent over Darren's monitor station. "Care? What's going on?" Yanking her coat from the rack, she stuffed her arms through the sleeves, grappling for the zipper pull as Jim caught up with her. "Carrie, what are you doing?" "I don't know what you've gotten us into on that mountain, but there is something going on here that isn't natural." "Not natural? What? Care, slow down. What are you talking about?" "Darren," she answered, numb fingers finally gripping the pull and zipping it tight. "The way he was acting toward me last week, the change in his health, change in behavior, roaming around at night. He's gained 8 pounds in a week, not catching any food. Josh caught an image of his eyes showing retro reflection on infrared. Human eyes can't do that, Jim. It's an anatomical impossibility." Jim was scrunching up his eyes and shaking his head as he tried to keep up with her rapid and admittedly outlandish statements. "Retro... Carrie, what on earth are you talking about?" But she just stuffed her hat on her head and snatched up her bag. "Talk to Josh. I'll pick up a remote line at Bugout. I need to go talk to this tribe." Chapter 9. The Legend.
Carrie, I can't believe you're up there chasing ghost stories.
Jim's voice chattered through the chopper's headset.
You've let him get to you. This is crazy.
Carrie just stared at the mountains passing by outside the helicopter doors. Only if we're really lucky, she responded, still running scenario after scenario through her churning brain. Think about it, though. Native Americans have been telling stories about predatory shapeshifters since before recorded history. The Blackfoot tell of the Wolfman. The Cherokee have stories of a tribe that can reportedly change into bears. The Navajo have naaldlooshii, the skinwalker. Tribes from all over the U.S. have similar legends, ranging anywhere from malevolent spellcasters, more feared than Salem's witches, to revered medicine men, to harbingers of death. But they all share the same animalistic foundations.
Carrie, honestly.
Europeans brought over stories of werewolves. Cults of lycanthropy date back as far as 1200 BC. The French have the loup-garou. The ancient Mesoamericans have the nahual. Think of it, Jim. How outrageously naive would we have to be to assume that all of these stories, from all over the world, from all periods of history, have no basis in fact? Do you think the ancient Greeks consulted with the Viking Ulfethnar before Zeus turned King Lycaon into a wolf?
Really, Care? Are you hearing yourself right now?
You saw Josh's footage. Human eyes can't produce that reflective glow. They don't have the proper anatomy. Darren would be in the mid to late stages of starvation in that video. There's no way he could muster the strength, let alone the fortitude, to chase down and catch a snowshoe hare with his bare hands. You saw his eyes. You saw how fast he moved. Now tell me that was normal, Jim.
All right, so it was a little freakish, but that doesn't mean that Darren Henderson, Ditzy Darren, has become some rocky-top Native American werewolf. Werewolf, Care.
I don't know what he is, Jim, but he's not Darren anymore. Taking a deep breath and scrunching her eyes shut, Carrie rappelled backwards out of the helicopter, swinging back and forth on her rope for a moment before carefully releasing some slack through her pulley. The wind off the chopper blades was buffeting snow in every direction, but soon her feet touched down onto solid earth. Ducking down, she disconnected herself from the pulley system and scurried out from beneath the hovering aircraft. 3 others were overseeing the supply drop, so Carrie hurried off, away from the pummeling gusts, moving instead toward the distant array of stone-walled conical buildings lining the steep ridge. Drawing up short, she hesitated, shielding her eyes with her hand as she squinted at a stocky figure standing among the snow-covered rocks. A blast of wind whipped a drift of white fluff into her face, and she turned, watching the chopper lift up and away, not to return until that afternoon when the supply team was scheduled to be picked up. Reaching up, she felt for the reassuring presence of the tiny earpiece, still firmly in place, though muted against Jim's constant haranguing. Turning back, Carrie started forward again, picking her way across the precarious landscape toward the figure among the rocks. Stopping about a dozen paces from him, she recognized his weathered features from Darren's headcam footage. Brow furrowing, she lifted her arm in what she thought she remembered as a Salish gesture of greeting. The weathered tribesman didn't return the gesture, but Carrie thought she saw his braids dip in a brief nod of acknowledgement. Hoping she was right, she pushed herself into motion again, closing the distance between them. Reaching him, she dipped her head deferentially. "My name is Carrie," she began, remembering the man's tentative grasp of the English language and searching for meaningful words that might have survived the decades of disuse. I need to know what the mountain is hiding, what you're guarding." The shaman gave an immediate jerk of his head, brows fixed and jaws bunching. Carrie didn't need a translation. No way. Pressing her lips tight, she sucked a frustrated breath through her nostrils, staring around the snowy landscape for inspiration. "Look," she finally began, "something has happened. One of the contestants, one of our people, he's changing." Pale gray eyes, unusual for the tribes in this area, flicked up to hers, and a muscle high in his cheek trembled. "Change." Carrie nodded, pulling her lips between her teeth as she reached for her phone. Yes, changing. His eyes, she circled her free hand over her own eyes in illustration. His hunger, and she rested her hand over her middle. The shaman's gaze watched her hand as it rubbed over her stomach, a furrow growing in the center of his brow. Checking his face, Carrie swiped open her screen and pulled up the still frame she'd had Josh send to her, a close zoom of Darren's impossibly luminescent eyes. One of the shaman's hands drifted up, fingers holding a slight tremor as he brushed them over the image of Darren's face. Then his eyes flicked up to hers before looking uncertainly toward the village. "Please," she pressed. Carrie watched the muscles in his jaw tense once or twice before he nodded his head, still looking off toward the scattering of conical stone-walled homes. Meeting her gaze once, He dipped his chin and walked off toward the village. Carrie ducked her head beneath the low rim of the doorway, securing the leather flap behind her. She heard the old man call out to someone inside. Tiponi? Curious, she followed him down a few stone steps into the warm interior of a dugout home. The inside walls were lined in the same glittering quartz-like stone as the exterior, and there was a low fire burning in the center of the large space, the smoke curling up and out through a hole in the center of the hide-covered roof. Drying herbs and animal tokens lined the walls and overhead beams, lending the circular stone room a somewhat mystical feel. A younger woman with long braids, Tiponi presumably, looked up at their entrance. She might have been an older daughter, or even a younger wife in her furs and beaded necklaces, and she stilled in her motions of tending the fire as they walked in, eyeing Carrie with open uncertainty. Tipping her head in the woman's direction, Carrie brushed past dangling eagle's wing, following the old man's gesturing arm as he motioned her to sit across from him at the fire. Silence followed her descent, and she watched the pair carefully, firelight glinting off the dark claws adorning the shaman's bone necklace. Too large to be wolf, or even bear. Finally, he took a breath. Turning to Tiponi, he began to speak to her in a low voice. After an uneasy glance in her direction, she began to translate, her voice carrying the thick and beautiful articulations of the southwestern tribes. Fathers of our fathers, and their fathers before. Keepers of our people from all tribes. We guard the restless one, the ageless, the unnamed. Ice prickled across Carrie's limbs, and she licked her suddenly dry lips. The unnamed? Nodding slowly, she went on. Each tribe has their stories, their legends, how he who lives above brought life to the earth, how the light came and the trees sprang forth, and the creatures came to walk the land. The shaman was still murmuring to her as she spoke, and she nodded in time with his words as her expression darkened. Then came but she paused, working her hands as she tried to find the right word. The wrong ones. The mistakes. Despite herself, Carrie found herself leaning forward, her bubbling anxiety temporarily eclipsed as she was drawn into the quiet woman's gentle cadence. The claymen, the tricksters, the spider. They all disappointed, disobeyed. But when he who lives above sought to sweep them from the land, one survived. Carrie swallowed. This wasn't the legend she'd been expecting. Which one? Tiponi shook her head, eyes lifting to the shamans for a moment. Each tribe will say different, but the ageless one remained, seeking to gain the Creator's favor by taking the parts of the creatures he loved best. The velvet prongs of the elk, the golden eyes of the wolf, the sturdy legs of the buffalo. But his thieving repulsed the Creator, and he fell even further from favor. And when he who lives above finally created man, the unnamed looked upon him with bitterness. Deep was his envy, and he sought to lower man in the Creator's eyes. Pausing, the shaman gestured at a horned skull hanging from the overhead beams, the coils of its caprine appendages nearly 3 feet wide. The first men saw through the unnamed's lies, driving him out of their villages as he cast temptations at their feet. But he was patient and clever, and he returned to tempt the first men's children, grooming them to be weak to their desires, seducing their spirits with whispers of speed and strength and power. When the first of these descendants finally came to him, her soul tainted with envy for another woman's husband, the unnamed smiled on her and gifted her with the cunning beauty of the vixen. But once she had stolen away her man, the fox inside her continued to prowl, heeding her blood, driving her from her hut at night to feast on rodents and fowl. When finally the tribe discovered what she'd become, she too was driven away to weep at the unnamed's feet. Another sought to best his brother hunters, and so the unnamed made him as the jaguar, swift, agile, and fierce. But when the blood of his prey touched his lips, his teeth grew to shred its flesh, and a tail sprouted from his spine. His mind became feral, and he disappeared forever into the forests. Again, the unnamed was pleased with the pain he had caused the Creator's children. Carrie's mind was taking in the unfamiliar legend with the same level of scrutiny as she had devoted to her coursework. A shape-shifting trickster, a devil in disguise, common enough traits for many civilizations across history, but something about this story was nagging at her. A fox woman, like the Japanese kitsune? And the other, how would a tribe this far north even know what a jaguar was? She knew of the nahual and Unca, but those legends were firmly based in South America, Mexico at the closest. From somewhere deep in her pocket, she felt the buzz of a text coming to her phone, answering the question of whether or not it would function on the system's remote data link. She ignored it, not wanting to interrupt the story. Brow fixed in a position of rapt attention, she listened on, trying to make sense of the unnatural conglomeration of different cultures, all slowly following a broken path back to the same sinister source. The shaman's voice rose and fell as he narrated on, the stronger voice of Toponi seated beside him, describing the unnamed traveling the world, sowing discord among peoples, cultivating greed and vile ambition, and rewarding those who sought him out, only for them to be consumed by violent, bestial transformations. The unnamed's power continued to grow, the more children he had serving at his feet, feeding his tainted spirit with the fear of the Creator's children, until one day, seeking reprieve, the tribes of our fathers came together and sent their strongest of spirit, Namaka, of the earth and sky, to ask he who lives above for help. And so Namaka climbed to the top of the tallest mountain and called out to the sky for his maker. Hearing Namaka's cries, he who lives above turned his eyes once more back to the world below. He saw then the horrors created by the unnamed, the ageless one, the tempter. And also he saw the pure spirit of Namaka and the pain in his heart. That which my folly thought to steal, he who lives above spoke. I will bless such to you, and so you shall contend his evil. And one by one, the spirit animals of the earth descended to share a portion of themselves with Namaka. Then, armed with the strength of creation, the spirit warrior descended the mountain once more. From her pocket, Carrie felt her phone give a longer buzz, and she silently berated herself for not simply turning the damn thing off. Reaching down, she silenced it with a click and turned back to her two hosts. But Namaka couldn't have won, right? Not if your tribe is still here, guarding him. Toponi solemnly shook her head. No. Namaka called on the tribes to sound the drums and gathered the strongest hunters, dipping their spears and arrows in sacred ash. But when they confronted the unnamed, his powers were still too great. They could not defeat him. But even though they could not kill him, they drove him back, wounding and harrying him until he retreated, seeking refuge in a cave high in the cold mountains. Carrie felt a chill run down her arms as the wind gusted outside the heavy hide door, and she turned, as if she would see the unnamed peeking through the flap. Following her gaze, the woman spoke on in hushed tones, not bothering to wait for the shaman's prompting. Knowing the power of the unnamed could never be matched as he was, Namaka took it upon himself to guard the cave where the unnamed lay hidden, licking his wounds. And, using the power the Creator had granted him, he cast a web across the mountain, sealing himself and the unnamed inside for eternity. His hunters he sent out to hunt the beasts of the night that the unnamed had sired, each kill draining more power from the unnamed spirit. And he remains? Your tribe guards him still? But she shook her head. We are all tribes, as all are needed to guard him since Namaka left to join the spirits. We are Blackfoot, Wintun, Navajo, and Montauk. We are Mayan and Chono, Lenape and Aleut. Hopi, she added with a hand to her chest. Each of us descended from the leaders of the great battle with the unnamed. We have gained more over the generations, but the unnamed is still strong, and our numbers dwindle. The medicine, Carrie murmured. Jim said you were hit hard by influenza, fever. The woman's forehead wrinkled, and she turned to the tribesmen, who had just begun speaking again. The village leaders, in their drive to protect our people, deemed the sacrifice of your people a small price when weighed against our duty. But they did not ask Mahasani before agreeing.
If they had, we never would have allowed you on this mountain.
Carrie felt suddenly very unwelcome, and she swallowed, slapping her hand down hard over her pocket as the buzzing rose once more. She nodded slowly at Mahasani, finally knowing his name. The contestants, our people on the mountain, they're in danger, aren't they? She didn't phrase it as a question, but she still felt her stomach sink when she saw the grave look steal over Mahasani's features. The whole world is in danger, Toponi responded. If the Unnamed is allowed to father another scion, his power will begin to grow again. Carrie's phone gave another sharp buzz, and she finally thrust her hand into her pocket. Excuse me, I'm really sorry, but she cut off as the text message alert on her lock screen expanded to read, Carrie, for the love of God, open your goddamn phone. Chapter 10. The Beast. Jim could hear the chopper blades buffeting the microphone on Carrie's remote earpiece. She had adamantly refused to wear her headcam, maintaining she didn't want to intrude on the privacy of the tribe. The rhythmic pummeling drifted away, and Jim was left with just the sound of Carrie's heavy breathing and the muffled crunch of snow beneath her feet. The sounds hesitated for a moment, then Carrie's voice came through.
My name is Carrie.
Care, who is it? Who do you see? Damn it, this is why you need to be wearing your headcam. Carrie didn't answer, though, just went on speaking to whomever was there with her. Carrie? He asked again. Still no answer. Damn it, Carrie! And he ripped the headset from his ears. Turning at the startled looks from the tech crew Carrie had enlisted to fast-track through the trail cam footage, he grimaced. She's muted me. Sighing, he dropped the head loop to the desk and rubbed his fingers over his forehead. Honestly, what is she expecting to see on those cams? All they're going to find is some old man stomping around in the dark trying to scare off my contestants. Sighing, he fitted the headset back on over his ears, hearing the sound of a woman's voice, though clearly not Carrie's. Frowning, he began to listen. Holy shit! Jim blinked, startled by the unexpected outburst mere feet away from him. Straightening in his chair, he looked over. It was Josh, and he was staring at his video feed, face deathly pale. What is it? But Josh just shook his head, mouth working like a grounded fish but not finding his words as he stared in rapt attention at his screen. Finally, he looked up, hand moving in rapid gestures for Jim to come and look. Frowning, he slipped the headset off and crossed over to Josh's desk. He was scrubbing backward on the playback, his whole screen taken up by the muted greens of infrared cameras. As Jim leaned down to look, Josh hit play again. After what I showed Carrie, I wanted to start from the night of the first field check, when Darren first went missing. Look. At first, Jim saw nothing he would call unusual. He could see the entrance of Darren's shelter, a large portion of the snow-dusted clearing, and a head-on view of the edge of the forest. He watched as Darren stared out at the trees, flashlight in hand, and then walked out into the forest. Okay. Wait for it. Scanning the playback forward until he reached a certain count, he popped his fingertip down on the mouse, resuming normal speed. Eyes fixated, he scooted forward, pointing to an anticipatory spot on the distant tree line. Eyes narrowing, Jim watched. A movement among the trees caught his attention. A bear? No, but Jim felt his face go cold. What the hell? I don't know, man, but it's nothing I've ever seen before. Can you clean it up any? Josh shook his head. No need. Watch. A moment later, Darren returned, walking right by the creature through the blind spot Carrie had been so worried about. Pausing, he gave a defeated shake of the head and clicked off his flashlight, only then trudging around to the front of his shelter and slipping inside. Crow's Nest isn't infrared, Josh muttered. The viewers never saw him come back that night. Now watch. Leaning in as close as he could, Jim watched as the creature followed Darren's trail and emerged from the trees, sniffing deeply as it entered the camp. It hesitated there, hovering in the blind spot, the light from Darren's fire illuminating enough of it for the camera to pick up its shape in near-perfect resolution. A rush of ice passed straight down to Jim's core. The beast stood taller than a grizzly, but its face was that of a wolf, fanged and slavering. Sprouting from its head were giant caribou-esque antlers. Its hulking body was draped in layers of tattered animal skins, but below them, Jim could make out the thickened, furred, bison-like legs. And from its back... The fuck? Are those wings? But Josh shook his head. not taking his eyes from the screen as 8 spindly arachnoid legs unfurled from beneath the skins on its back and began flitting over the data tower behind Darren's shelter, like a spider feeling out an unusually large fly. A deep, snuffling bluster, worthy of a bull moose, blew from the creature's muzzle, and it lashed out, bringing one gnarled hand down in a slashing motion over the equipment. "That's when the live feed went down," Josh whispered, as if the creature in the video might hear him. The wide antler rack rose as the creature straightened again, rubbing its fingers together as if it had had to touch something nasty. Claws, the length of Jim's hand, flashed in the light from the fire, as it then turned its attention to Darren's shelter. A keening sound rose in the clearing, and the giant spidery legs began all moving in tandem, as if wrapping a bug in silk. The creature began to bend and crouch, rocking to an unheard rhythm as claws and hands reached toward the shelter in repetitive, beckoning motions. The keening turned to a chant of guttural, hissing growls, and then Darren stepped out of his shelter, face empty and eyes dead. Jim would have sworn there were no words being spoken, but Darren suddenly nodded, and the motion of the spidery legs increased, flitting around Darren's body as the clawed hands moved in silent gestures around his face. Darren's eyes rolled back, and his lid slid closed. He took a quick, sucking breath, then a deeper one. One more, and he let out a primal, animalistic scream, nearly a howl in the stillness of the night. Silence filled the warehouse. Jumping at a scuffed boot, Jim turned to find the entire tech team and viewers standing behind him. Chapter 11. The Message. Shit. This was not something he had prepared for. Hell, who would be prepared for this? Spinning back to Josh, he pointed at the feed. "Get me a screenshot. A good one." Then he spun to the viewers. "Tell your contestants to pack their things. I'm sending Bug out. I want everyone on headcams immediately and tell them not to take them off until they're back in civilization. Where's Dr. Gillis? Have they already left Holly?" Someone near the back of the crowd looked down at a tablet. "Yeah, it looks like they're scheduled to hit Todd's camp in 5. They got held up making it to Holly because of some thick ice." "Good. Get them on the radio. Tell them not to bother with an exam. Just get Todd out of there. I'll send Bug out straight to Holly. That'll save time." His phone buzzed, and he thrust his hand into his pocket. Flicking open the home screen, the terrifying features of the mountain creature met his eyes. Stifling a shudder, he quickly sent the image to Carrie before rushing back over to his seat and jamming the headset back down over his ears. Carrie, please tell me you can hear me." But no response came from the headset. "Damn it!" And he tore them off again. Running his fingers back through his hair, he reached for his phone instead. Finding her contact, he fumbled to press call. The monotonous buzzing of a connecting line droned in his ear until a cheery version of Carrie's voice picked up, telling him to leave a message. "Fuck!" Slamming the phone down on the desktop, he spun to the field check team. "How far out is the chopper?" The man with the tablet shook his head, looking down at his display. 2 hours, maybe less. The pilot had to refuel after this run." "Ah!" Gripping his hair by the roots, he spun on the spot, frustrated at every angle. Dipping back to his desk for a moment, he punched call on Carrie's number again, switching it to speakerphone. "Call the company. See if they have anyone that can fly out sooner. Tell them it's an emergency. If that doesn't work, call rescue. Tell them we have several people in immediate danger on the mountain and they need helicopter extraction." "This is Carrie. Leave me a message."
"God damn it, Carrie! Pick up your damn phone!" Closing the line, he hit call again. "Boss!" Jim's head snapped around at the strangled shout from field check. A crowd of people rushed over with him, and he leaned low over the young man's shoulder. "Oh my God." Lurching to the side as his gorge rose in his throat, Jim vomited into the desk-side trash can. Todd Sawyer's headless body dangled from a gnarled hemlock tree, impaled through the chest by a broken-off limb to hang with his toes just brushing the pebbled shore. Beside him, Jim could hear hurried instructions for the medboat to immediately vacate the area, then the revving of a boat engine. What happened?" he rasped, dragging a shaky knuckle across his bottom lip. He looked over to Todd's monitor station, but the viewers were both shaking their heads, clearly confused. In answer, the nearest one spun the whole screen around to show Todd's headcam still bobbing around the camp. "We've had headcam view up since you told us," he insisted, leaning over to stare as the view started lumbering toward the retreating medboat. I mean, there was a quick tumble just a moment ago when he slipped down a short embankment, but after a few minutes we squawked him and he went and put it right back on." "Are you sure it was him?" Josh's tremulous voice asked from the back of the small crowd.
Turning the screen back around, he made a quick adjustment with his mouse. "Oh, God. What?" Jim barked, and the viewer spun the screen around again. Darren was striding through the camp, Todd's camera riding at his brow. Jim watched as he took several deep breaths staring out at the icy lake, then turned and stalked back into the camp. "Flip back to headcam," Jim ordered. "Don't let him out of your sight. I want to know where he is and what he's doing at all times." "But, boss, what if he takes it off?" "Just keep the feed up," he shouted as he made for his own desk again. Desperate, he tried Carrie's number one more time, listening to the empty tones as he circled back to the live feed. The camera was pointing toward the ground as Darren strode through the camp, snowy earth and exposed rocks sliding by beneath his view. He reached a well-trodden area of dirt and paused, camera dipping further as his hands moved to the front of his pants. A stream of piss arced down on screen. Lips curling, Jim ground his teeth as Carrie's familiar voicemail message chirped out again. Then the camera view lifted and Jim cried out, along with half of his staff as Todd's severed head stared down at them, eyes staring and mouth gaping, mounted over the apex of his shelter like prize game. Taking several deep breaths and turning away, he bent to his phone and typed, "Carrie, for the love of God, open your goddamn phone." Chapter 12. The Mission. Carrie frowned down at the text message taking up her lock screen. Standing, she moved away from the fire, swiping at the screen with her gloved hand. After a few failed attempts, she yanked the glove off and flicked the screen open. Her knees buckled and she nearly went down, falling roughly against the wall amid a tangle of bones and bird wings. "Tiponi!" The shaman's voice was urgent, and Carrie's suddenly numb limbs were caught in a firm grip as she slid the rest of the way to the floor. Her vision darkened and bloomed again as she blinked with wide eyes, struggling not to pass out. Vision returning in a widening tunnel of sparking light, she stared into the woman's eyes as she held herself steady. "Tiponi?" She nodded, brows furrowed, then looked down as Carrie brought the image of the monster around for her to see. Tiponi's jaw clamped shut, and the muscles beneath her eyes began to quiver. Her phone gave another buzz, and Tiponi suddenly cried out, turning her face away. Carrie swung the screen back around and slapped a hand over her mouth, muffling the strangled cry that escaped at the sight of a decapitated body impaled on a tree. Fingers numb, the phone slipped to the ground, and she scrambled to find it again through a second wave of tunneling darkness. Warm hands brushed hers aside, and Mahasani closed his weathered grip around her phone. Turning it around to look, his features darkened and hardened into a mask Carrie couldn't read. Slowly, he handed it back to her and turned away. Carrie immediately flicked the image away and hurried to dial Jim. It rang once.
Carrie, thank God.
"Jim, what?"
"No, listen to me, Care. We've got to get you off that mountain, now. You and the supply team."
Carrie shook her head, gaze flicking up to Tiponi's as she watched with worried eyes. Bringing the phone down, she hit the speaker button. "The pilot said he couldn't make it back until noon at the earliest."
"I know. I've got a boat headed for Darren's camp right now. They'll be there in 5 minutes. It's only a short walk from the village. I need you to meet them there."
"Are you out of your mind? Not with that thing stalking around down there, after what you just showed me?"
"That thing didn't do that."
A brief pause and a sigh let the noise of the background scramble inside the warehouse reach her through the line.
"Darren did."
"What?"
"But we have eyes on him still in Todd's camp,"
he hurried on.
"That's nearly 2 hours away by foot. If you leave now, you'll be safe."
"Darren did that?" she repeated, still struggling with the idea that Darren could be capable of such a monstrous act. Though after what she had just heard from Mahasani and Tiponi, and what she had witnessed when she went to find him in the forest.
"You were right, Care. Whatever's going on in these mountains."
But he didn't finish. He didn't have to.
"I don't know when we'll be able to get a chopper out to you. And when we do, I want everybody present and accounted for at Bug Out. Dr. Gillis is heading back to pick up Holly, and a separate team is headed for you. I told them to meet you at Darren's fishing nets. I sent them with the bear stoppers."
Carrie breathed a small sigh of relief, immeasurably glad now that she hadn't backed down regarding the investment of several big game rifles. "All right. I'll get everyone to Darren's camp."
"I know you will,"
Jim answered, and the faith in his voice was almost enough to make Carrie believe it too.
"Keep eyes and ears on at all times. I'll be watching from here."
"I will," she promised. Then she ended the call, reaching up to open the line at her earpiece. After a moment, she heard a tinny rattle, then,
"You got me, Care?"
"I got you."
"Good. See you back home."
Chapter 13. The Descent. Carrie took a deep breath. Looking up, she saw Toponi watching her face and Mahasani off in the distance, silently running his fingers over the feathers of one of the giant eagle wings. "I need to get my team out of here," she told the kind-faced Hopi woman. Then she turned to Mahasani. "Which way did you go when you went to speak with Darren? What direction is his camp?" "I will show you," Toponi said quickly, cutting off a sharp negation from Mahasani before beginning to argue with him in a rapid tongue. Carrie didn't recognize the language, but she thought she could pick up the cadence of the Southwest, mixed with what she thought must be Hindi and even a hint of Latin. Finally, after a sharp word from Mahasani, Toponi turned and strode to the other side of the small home, jerking a bone-handled knife from a leather sheath against the wall. A plume of white ash followed in its wake, nearly obscuring the flash of an obsidian blade, and Mahasani's tirade faltered. She spoke once more, tone one of firm resolve, before slamming the knife back home and turning to Carrie. "I will take you." Carrie blinked hard against the double brightness of the snow-covered ground. Toponi emerged behind her, pulling a fur-lined hood over her black hair. When they reached the edge of the village, it was to find a frantic search in progress, her team trying with rudimentary hand gestures to communicate with the few tribesmen who had come out to assist. One of the supply team caught sight of her and rushed over, skidding to a halt on the snow-covered ground. "Carrie," he panted, "Jim's been screaming for you for the past 20 minutes. Where'd you go?" "Getting the rest of the story," she answered, taking in the harried look of the team rushing up to her. "I've gotten in touch with Jim. There's been an incident." She took a moment to fill the team in on what had happened, explaining it as Darren losing his grip and turning to hunting humans. For brevity's sake, she left out any involvement of the Unnamed and Darren's possible were-morphing into some unknown animal. Then, to avoid any skepticism that might hinder their progress, she showed them the screenshot of Todd, earning her 3 pale faces and 2 loud vomits into the snow. Toponi took the lead after that, escorting them to the edge of a tall rise and stepping out onto a precarious sheep's trail down the mountain. "Who is Mahasani to you?" Carrie asked quietly as she edged along behind Toponi, keeping easy pace with the Hopi woman, quietly thankful for the frequent hunting trips her father had taken her on growing up. "He is my father," she answered, confirming Carrie's earlier suspicions. "And also my machistu." Carrie frowned, not recognizing the term. "Perhaps some variant of magister?" "My mother was born of the Hopi nation, and she was called to give herself to Cold Mountain after hearing the legend of the Unnamed. It happens that way sometimes, the calling. I was born to her and the Mahasani several years later, and I became his student as I grew." The Mahasani, so it was a title rather than a name. A sharp scuff drew Carrie's gaze behind her as one of the supply crew caught his balance against the sheer rock wall. He turned his head to the sky with a murmured supplication before inching on. Grimacing in sympathy, Carrie turned back to Toponi, who was traversing the narrow rocky path with the confidence of a mountain goat.
"Carrie, you there?"
Carrie brought her glove to cup over the receiver at her ear, blocking the rush of wind as she tried to listen. "Jim?"
"Carrie, we've lost visual on Darren."
"You what?"
"We've still got audio,"
he hurried to assure her.
"We can hear him rustling around in the woods. But he reached up and covered the camera a second ago, and he hasn't let up yet. We think he's carrying it around in his hand for some reason. He was by Todd's fire pit not 2 minutes ago, though, so you're still good on time. Bug out is idling and ready for whenever you get there."
Carrie worked to calm her pounding heart. Okay, we'll make it there."
"I'll let you know if we get visual back on Darren."
"Thanks," she answered, then relayed Jim's message back to the rest of the team. Toponi, hearing her words, furrowed her brow and increased her pace down the narrow trail. Soon the trail widened out and the way became easier. Darren's feed came back after only a few minutes, though Jim couldn't tell her exactly where he was. But he promised to let her know as soon as he recognized Darren's surroundings. Toponi led them through a dense spruce grove and then shimmied between a gap in 2 large rock faces. Carrie slid on in her wake, feeling invisible eyes on her as the narrow pass hid them in deep shadows. Emerging onto a tall rise on the other side, Carrie looked down and breathed a sigh of relief. Darren's camp was just visible in the distance below them, the bug-out boat a bright beacon on the edge of the lake. 20 minutes, tops, and they would be out of this place.
"We've lost him again, Care,"
came Jim's voice in her ear.
"I don't know why he keeps going dark, but I've got search and rescue headed up right now. Holly and Dr. Gillis are safe at Bug Out. We're just waiting on you guys now. You make it to the boat and you're home free."
Home free. "I hear you. I'm in sight of the camp. We won't be long."
"Good. I'll breathe again when you're all out of there. Then we can figure out what to do about Darren.
Yeah, me too. Carrie relayed Jim's words again to a wave of relieved sounds from the team. Toponi, though, frowned again. He is playing with you. Carrie looked over at her, standing at the edge of the rise. Sorry? This Darren, whatever he was before, the Unnamed is changing him, turning him into something that enjoys games. Carrie felt the familiar burn of anxiety ice through her veins as she looked out over the camp. Well, he's too far away to cause us any trouble. If we hurry, we'll be long gone before Darren makes it anywhere near his camp. Toponi pressed her lips together but didn't reply, keeping her eyes on the clearing below them. Not speaking, she moved off again into the dense trees. Chapter 14. The Flight. Toponi, when we get to the boat, I want you to come with us. Toponi turned to look at Carrie as they approached Darren's camp through the thick undergrowth. With? Not far, Carrie hurried to reassure her. I'd just feel better if we could chopper you back up to your village, rather than making you climb all the way back up there by yourself. Not with...
Shit! Carrie, do not approach the boat! Get away from the camp!
Cold prickles shot across Carrie's face, making her lips go numb. Jim?
Run, Carrie! He's there! I don't know how he got there so fast, but...
Then his voice went suddenly distant, as if he were covering his microphone with his hand.
No, tell them not to wait. I can see them on Darren's cam. He's looking right at them. Tell them to move.
Jim? Jim, what's going on? In the distance, the sound of a boat revving met her ears, and then...
Oh, shit!
Jim! A rifle shot rang out over the sound of the boat, then screaming. Another shot. Oh, God.
Carrie, get out of there now!
Carrie didn't hesitate after that. Grabbing Toponi by the arm, she sprinted back into the trees, calling out in a strangled whisper for the others to follow. Gunfire and screams followed on their heels, driving them faster and deeper into the trees. Carrie's heart was thundering out of control, and tears were turning to icy streaks on her wind-chapped face. She ran until her lungs burned and her legs felt on fire. Stumbling to a halt, she staggered to the side and braced her back against a large tree, breath heaving. Toponi stood hidden a few paces away from her, not nearly as winded, gripping the bone handle of her knife. Searching her other side, Carrie counted the others with her. 1, 2. Where was the third? Chancing it, Carrie inched her gaze out from around the wide trunk, searching for the last member of her supply team. She found him about 50 yards back, hunched over his knees and panting near to gagging. Be quiet, you idiot, she silently berated him, struggling to control her own breathing even as she thought this.
Carrie.
Jim's voice was barely a whisper in her ear, but she still jumped, sucking in her breath and thumping her head back against the tree as she closed her eyes. Not trusting her situation enough to speak, she lifted her hand and gave 2 quiet taps against her earpiece, nodding her head cam as she did.
Carrie, Bugout's gone. He got all of them.
Tears welled and Carrie sucked back a sob, nodding her head again.
I've got a second chopper coming. One of them is heading for Bugout Station. The other I'm sending directly to you. When you hear it coming, make for the clearing. Hear?
She nodded for a third time, checking the sun in the sky. It wasn't long after noon, but they would lose their light early in these dense trees, shaded on all sides by tall peaks.
Good. Darren's in the forest. After he finished, he headed east out of the camp. I don't know what direction you'll be coming from, so be careful.
Carrie's breathing stopped. Jim must have heard.
Carrie?
Not knowing what else to do, she just nodded for a final time, a small sound escaping from her throat.
Shit. Carrie, be careful.
Looking over at Toponi, Carrie lifted her arm and mimed moving forward again. Toponi caught the motion and nodded, searching the area ahead of them as they prepared to move again. Turning the other direction, she motioned the other 3 to do the same, leaning around the tree to make sure the one in the rear saw her.
Damn it! Carrie, I see you! He's behind you! Run!
Run! She cried, not caring if she was heard now. They tore off into the trees, dodging branches and leaping over deadfall as they ran. Carrie gritted her teeth as a scream rang out behind her, and she pushed her legs even harder, leaping a frozen creek and skidding down the scree on the other side of the embankment. Vegetation whipped at her face, but she raced on, adrenaline pushing her past the fire in her lungs. A crash behind her jerked her gaze around as she ran, and she saw one of the last 2 team members trip over a loose rock. The man running next to him slowed, turning on instinct to help him up. Darren loomed up in the distance, his silhouette leaping down off the rocky crags above them. She didn't need Jim's shouted warning as it leapt through her earpiece, but she cried out to her men behind her, "Move! Run for the trees!" They spun, wasting precious time as they searched behind them. "Move!" And whether they saw Darren moving among the low rocks or not, Carrie wasn't sure, but before she sprinted ahead again, the two hurried off in the other direction, back into the trees. No screams rose from the forest, and that knowledge, while a comfort in the dim recesses of her mind, also kept her pushing forward, haunted by the knowledge that it was she Darren was hunting. They came to a stream, its waters swift enough that it hadn't frozen over yet. Both Toponi and Carrie rushed into its current, racing the shallow water as it meandered down through the trees. Toponi was in the lead, and when Carrie watched her suddenly disappear over a ledge, she didn't hesitate. Reaching the edge, Carrie leapt with all her strength, arms windmilling and legs pumping as she worked to keep her balance through the fall. She dropped about 6 feet, heart in her head, before splashing down into a shallow pool, just managing to keep her feet. Icy water soaked the bottom of her pants, seeping down over the tops of her waterproof snow boots. She stared around, ignoring the icy sting. Toponi was gone. Chapter 15. The Stream. A muffled hiss spun Carrie around to find Toponi's face peeking out from a small cave behind the waterfall. Relief washed over her, and she hurried to splash over to Toponi's side, squeezing into the shallow depression behind the waterfall. She leaned against the wet rock face as cold mountain water and snowmelt splashed her heated face. "Jim," she whispered through her heaving breath, trusting the rush of the water to hide her voice.
"I'm here, Care. He made it to the stream, but he's lost you for now."
Seemingly in answer, a cry echoed down from the hill behind them, sounding more feline than human, like a leopard or a mountain lion. And cats like to play with their food, Carrie thought in a panic-induced spike of dark humor. "The others?" she breathed.
"Parker and Trey got clear in time, back at the ridge. Kevin got it pretty bad, though. I don't think he made it."
A heavy breath gusted over Jim's microphone as he sighed.
"I'm sorry, Care. If I'd just told you to stay at the village."
"You couldn't have known," she answered, privately thinking she should have thought of that herself. "Where is he?"
"He overshot the creek you jumped in. He's making his way back to it, sniffing around like a hound. Really, Care, whatever's going on here, I've got no way to explain it. He took 2 shots in the fight by the lake and just kept on like nothing happened."
At this point, she shouldn't even be surprised, but Carrie still couldn't suppress the new wave of helplessness and fear that washed over her at Jim's words. Thumping her head back against the damp stone, she sucked in a breath, willing herself not to cry. Crying wouldn't help her right now. She looked over at Toponi. The Hopi woman had a tight grip on the bone handle of her knife, watching the forest beyond the waterfall with a steady gaze. "He's back where we met the stream," she told her in a low voice. "Or near there. Jim says he overshot and he's trying to find our trail." Toponi nodded. "Water. Running water disrupts his magic." Magic? Carrie had simply assumed it was a matter of tracking. "Do you know where this stream leads?" She nodded. "We crossed over the lower portion when we were traveling toward where the hunter made camp. We are north of that place now. This stream will flow down to well east of there before it meets the lake. So we could potentially follow it all the way to the lake and then walk the shoreline in?" Toponi looked away for a moment as she thought. "Yes, the terrain should allow for that, but we must stay in the water. It will be cold." Carrie frowned down at her boots. She should be fine as long as they didn't hit any more deep areas, but Toponi didn't have commercial waterproof Arctic gear to keep the cold away. "I don't think we have a choice." Nodding once, Toponi lifted her dagger, running 2 fingers through the ash on its blade. Turning to Carrie, she reached out, smudging the ash over and around her eyes. Startled, Carrie drew back only slightly before steadying and holding still as Toponi obscured her other eye, then repeated the process on herself. "This will help hide you when the water cannot." Grateful, Carrie attempted a tight smile, which Toponi returned in kind. "All right, Jim, did you get all that?"
"Got it. I'll have the chopper looking for you along the shoreline east of the camp. I'd hurry, though. He made it back to the stream. It's only a matter of time before he figures out you followed it."
Turning to Toponi, she nodded. "We need to go." Chapter 16. The Unnamed. They slogged through the frosty waters of the mountain stream as quickly as they could, the sound of chopper blades rising in the distance, buoying Carrie's spirits and driving her on nearly as fast as the threat of Darren looming somewhere behind them.
Carrie, the chopper's there. How far are you?
Hard to say. 10 minutes? We've got to keep to the stream, and it's not a straight shot.
All right, I'll let them know. Just try to get there as fast as you can.
Working on it, she puffed, moving her sodden feet faster by sheer willpower. A few minutes later, though, Jim's voice returned, swearing into the receiver.
No, tell them not to leave. I've still got a line on at least 2 people down there. Carrie, you there? The choppers had to move off. Darren rushed the shore when they came into range and started hurling rocks at them. They tried to hover out of range, but Darren managed to crack the windshield. After that, they said they had to put some distance between the bird and the shore.
How much distance? Jim took a deep breath.
Darren's rock hit them at a half-mile. They're hovering 2 miles out until you're in visual range of the shore.
Carrie felt her heart sink as Jim spoke, knowing in her gut the chopper pilot wouldn't chance coming back into range if Darren was able to bring it down by just throwing stones. I'll let you know when we're there, she said, voice shaking, despite her best effort. She wasn't going to get out of here, and she knew that Jim knew it too.
Atta girl,
he choked out in return. Toponi suddenly stopped in her tracks.
Care? What's wrong? Why's she stopped?
I don't know. Toponi? But Toponi thrust out a cautionary hand, head swiveling around as she listened, gaze sweeping the forest like a hawk. Suddenly, she froze, eyes fixing on the trees off to the east. Crouching, she drew her knife, stepping carefully back out of the water and letting out a low, predatory hiss. Following her gaze, Carrie stared at the trees, at first seeing nothing, but then a whisper of shadows caught her eye, and she backed immediately away, moving to stand beside Toponi and placing the moving water firmly between her and the approaching shape. "Is it Darren?" she asked, still not able to properly make out the shape moving between the trees. But no, it couldn't be. It was too tall, too broad to be a person.
It's not Darren,
Jim answered.
He's still eyeing the chopper from the... Wait, shit, Care, he's running. He's moving fast. Northeast, out of camp.
Oh, God. Darren's coming for us, she whispered. We need to get back into the water. No, Toponi answered, eyes not leaving the shape looming out of the early shadows among the trees. He comes to his master. His... And Carrie turned back to the hulking creature, a wave of fear and dread making her knees go weak and her skin race with numbing prickles. Oh, God. In the distance, the sound of drums rose on the wind. Carrie's heart beat in time with them, thudding nearly out of her chest as she and Toponi backed away. It approached slowly, shape coalescing out of the dim light like a gathering smoke. The outline of immense, lichen-draped antlers loomed above its head among the branches of birch and hemlock. Its lupine face appeared calm as it approached, its steps never quickening as it closed on them. A rush of crashing underbrush jerked Carrie's attention to the west.
Oh, Carrie, I can see you. Get out of there!
But there was nowhere to go. Hot tears ran down her cheeks as she watched Darren rushing toward them through the trees. Toponi crouched by her side, blade in hand, eyes darting between the two threats. As a last resort, Carrie bent and picked up a heavy rock from the stream bank, needing the reassurance of having a weapon in her hand, primitive as it was. Turning back, she saw Darren was nearly upon them, moving faster than she would have believed possible, gaze fixed somewhere in the distance over her head. Then she remembered. The ash. Mirroring Toponi's stance, she crouched, heart soaring when his gaze didn't track her motions. She could see the whites of his eyes now, and when he was within range of Toponi's arm, the Hopi woman suddenly spun and slashed the obsidian blade along his body as he rushed by. Darren let out a yowl and staggered to the side, enough to catch Carrie's arcing blow against his temple. He crumpled, but not for long, rising to all fours and shaking his head like an animal. Carrie staggered backward, her shoulder meeting Toponi's as she hurried to do the same. Darren was watching them now, or he seemed to be, face tracking their movements as they backed through the underbrush. His lips pulled back to reveal sharp, elongated canines. Tilting his head, Carrie could see tall tufts of black hair topping his now pointed ears. A lynx, she thought, her biologist's need to classify things helping her mind keep focused. He might not be able to see us, but he can certainly hear us. Orienting on them, he crouched, bunching his body in a cat-like stance as he prepared to pounce. Carrie's breath was hissing in and out through her teeth as she readied herself to be taken out by Darren's sprouting claws. In the distance, the Unnamed lifted his gnarled hand, a guttural keening rising from his throat. Darren leapt. Carrie shrieked, coiling her arm to swing, but not before a black-tipped arrow erupted from Darren's chest. Gasping, Carrie dodged as Darren fell to the ground at her feet, shuffling backward until her back fetched up against the trunk of a tree. Wide-eyed, she looked up to find Mahasani, garbed in ceremonial splendor and flanked by 2 ash-painted warriors, bows drawn. Chapter 17. The Battle. Darren stirred at Carrie's feet. Mind racing, she hurried to establish what side of the chest the arrow had penetrated. Not the left. Damn it. Rising to his hands and knees, Darren earned another arrow to the back of the thigh. He screamed, the shrill yowl of the forest cat superimposed over the voice of the man in a chilling dissonance that raised all the hairs on Carrie's body. Scurrying into the shelter of the trees, Darren found his feet and retreated into the forest, the 2 arrow shafts protruding out behind him as he limped into the growing shadows. Pawn-bested, the Unnamed let out a roar, its hollow cry thundering over the mountainside, shaking snow from low branches in its fury. Carrie cowered, dropping to the heavy rock in her haste to clap her hands over her ears. The sound went on and on, longer than humanly possible, loud enough Carrie could feel the waves of it traveling up through her boots. Finally, it ebbed. The creature was hunched from the effort of its furious cry, and as the echoes of his revilement lifted from the hills, it was to the rising sound of drums, stronger and more insistent than before, as if the mountain itself were thrumming with lifeblood, the drums the rhythmic beating of its heart. Blinking open her squinted eyes, Carrie watched in horror as the Unnamed turned to Mahasani, the sound of its rage rumbling in its chest as it stalked toward the old shaman, 8 hair-covered arachnoid legs uncoiling from beneath the ragged animal skins on its back. Mahasani did not falter in his calm. The very image of him, arms broad and feathered like the eagle's, head dressed with the coiled might of massive ram's horns, even the whispering scuff of his feet as he moved with the rhythm of his calling lent him the air of permanence. He was solid, undeniable, immutable. Claws emerged from the mass of fetid skins, clenching and extending in its eagerness to strike a blow at its captors. Still, Mahasani danced on, arms opening wide as the cry of an eagle pierced the sky. A blue haze enveloped his wing-like breadth, and the drums rose in volume. Carrie could hear his low voice chanting in a language created by the blending of civilizations joined in a common mission. Cadence rising and falling with his motions, he closed on the Unnamed, ash-painted eyes distant in his purpose. The creature lashed out, claws tearing a path toward Mahasani's center, but the old shaman simply moved with him, luminous wings flaring as he spun with the momentum of the Unnamed's attack, striking a blow with claw-tipped gauntlets as he came full circle and pivoted around behind his opponent. The leather gauntlets left a wide rent in the layers of skins covering the Unnamed's massive form. Tasting their foe, Mahasani's claws too began to glow, and the halo image of a great bear rose in challenge around the steady form of the old man. The Unnamed struck again, and again Mahasani ghosted out of his reach, dipping and spinning to the sound of the drums and slashing a double blow against the thick pelt covering the creature's legs. The mountains shook again with the force of the Unnamed's fury, but Mahasani did not waver in his resolve, feet scuffing and shifting to the steady rhythm of the drums, wings drifting and claws flying in the increasingly lethal dance. The mountains shook again with the force of the Unnamed's fury, but Mahasani didn't waver in his resolve, feet scuffing and shifting to the steady rhythm of the drums, wings drifting and claws flying in his increasingly lethal dance. Each time the creature pushed its assault, Mahasani evaded, shifting with fluid ease and answering each attack with his own. Bloodied, the Unnamed suddenly faltered, shifting back a step and curling its lips back over its savage wolfen maw. The archers took their opening. The first arrow soared over Mahasani's outstretched arm, its passing echoed in the arc of his diving wing as it plunged into the Unnamed's neck. The creature staggered back, a rasping gargle emanating from its throat as moss-hung antlers shuddered. Another arrow stuck in its chest, then its shoulder, its chest again. Over and over the warriors released, striking their mark with lethal precision, each arrow's passage marked with a ghostly streamer of sacred ash. Finally, with an otherworldly wail, the Unnamed turned and fled into the trees, pursued by the steady pounding of war drums. Chapter 18. The Parting. Carrie stared at the Unnamed's retreating figure until it was lost among the harsh angles of rock and twisted trees. Toponi shifted where she stood, Carrie only then realizing she was kneeling in the snow, Toponi crouching defensively by her side. Carrie looked back to Mahasani. The old shaman had stilled in his steady motions and was now murmuring something under his breath, eyes closed. As she watched, the glow around him dimmed and then extinguished. Eyes sliding back open, he approached. Struggling against the shakiness in her limbs, Carrie stood, staring wide-eyed at the old man as he came to a halt in front of her. Her heart was thundering in her chest, and tingles of adrenaline were still racing over the skin of her face and fingers. Meeting her eyes, he nodded once, massive ram's horns dipping with the motion. "You go." Then he took Toponi's arm in a strong, fond grip. "We hunt." With a vicious grin, Toponi made a sharp yip like a coyote, lifting her blade to the warriors still on the hill. They returned her cry with enthusiastic ululations. The Hopi woman turned her face back to Carrie's. "Travel south as fast as you can. There you will meet the lake. We will keep the hunter from your heels." Without another word, the four melted away into the landscape, leaving Carrie alone in the woods before she had even had a chance to say thank you.
The fuck? What did I just watch?
Carrie jumped, having forgotten Jim was still riding in her ear. "You're asking me?"
Yeah, well...
Then his tone changed.
She's right, though. You need to move. I've lost visual with Darren. It looks like he's finally abandoned Todd's head cam.
"It's not fun anymore," she reasoned. "Not now that he's the one being hunted."
Be that as it may, who knows how long they'll be able to keep him occupied. Get your butt moving, Care.
"Moving. Right." And she checked the sun in the sky. South. Taking a deep breath, she started running. Chapter 19. The Escape. Carrie ran hard, her breath puffing a cloud of frozen air in front of her with every pump of her legs. An excited yipping rose on the air, and she skidded to a breathless halt, turning on the spot as she tried to listen. The sound of scree shifting in the distance seized her chest, though, and she sprinted to the south once more, feet flying over the uneven, rocky landscape. "I'm at Darren's chopping block," she panted as she ran, recognizing the clearing where she'd had her first disturbing exchange with the man, the morning after his encounter with the Unnamed.
I'll call in the chopper. Keep moving.
Carrie pushed herself harder, lungs burning with exertion and cold until she felt like she needed to throw up. Chopper blades sounded in the distance, and Carrie's heart soared. Despite the fire in her chest, a wild grin spread across her face as she burst through the trees, running for her life toward the approaching helicopter. A crashing of brush and scree jerked her attention to the rise high above her left shoulder. Darren crouched among the distant vegetation, feline teeth bared. Eyes tracking her as she ran, he let out a snarl and launched himself from the rocks, disappearing among the scrubby trees below. Carrie pushed herself harder, boots slamming into the ground as she forced herself to run faster. The chopper was lowering itself to the shore. Faster. A rescue cable was being lowered. Faster. Another sound drew her attention from the other direction. Parker and Trey, the two survivors of the supply team, were tearing out of the dense growth near the water's edge. Carrie spun in the other direction. She couldn't hear Darren anymore above the heavy percussion of the chopper blades, but she knew he was gaining on the clearing. 1 minute? Less? There might be time for her, but all three? Extending her legs, she dropped her head and pushed herself harder than she ever had before, tears streaming from the corners of her eyes as she sprinted straight past the hanging rescue cable. She slid to a gasping halt at the bow of the slaughtered bug-out team's boat. Someone was hollering at her to go back to the chopper. It could have been Jim. Could have been one of the other responders. Either way, she ignored them, vaulting instead into the gore-strewn boat, searching frantically through the massacre for one of the rifles she knew had to be there. There. Her fingers closed around the familiar slim length of the Remington bolt action, yanking it from the carnage. Parker and Trey had reached the chopper, and one of them, Trey, she thought, was being lifted to safety. A flicker of motion among the rocks to the east told her Darren was nearly to the camp. Scrabbling at the bolt with gloved fingers, Carrie finally used her teeth to rip it from her hand, drawing up and back on the bolt to find the chamber empty. Shit! Her eyes swept the interior of the boat, but there was so much wreckage and gore she couldn't get a fix on an ammo box. Giving up, she tossed the empty rifle aside, extricating another one from beneath a ravaged body, quickly followed by another. Working to keep her churning stomach under control, she ejected rounds as quickly as she could, loading them into the other gun until its capacity was full. Levering the bolt down into place, she checked the rescue chopper. The cable was being lowered back down, and Parker was waving frantically at her to hurry. Slipping and skidding on the mass of blood and entrails, Carrie braced one hand on the edge of the boat and flung herself over, racing for the lowering cable, staggering under the buffeting winds from the rotating blades. Her hand closed around the sturdy cable, and she scrambled to shimmy into the canvas sling, working it to wrap beneath her hips, all the while keeping her eyes fixed on the far tree line. The cable went taut, and she felt herself being lifted free of the pebbled shore. But no sooner had her feet lifted from the ground than Darren, bestial and crazed, burst through the underbrush on the far side of the camp. He was running fast, but she was halfway up. She saw the responder leaning out through the doors, watching her, oblivious to Darren racing across the clearing. He was nearly halfway to them, gaining momentum as he raced to close the distance. Shit, he's not planning on throwing rocks this time. He's going to jump. The winch stuttered, and Carrie felt herself being pulled inside. Tossing her rifle to the floor, she struggled out of the rescue harness, tossing it immediately back out the open door. One of the responders began attempting to check her over, but she pushed him away, reaching once again for the gun. Positioning herself at the open entrance, Carrie braced herself against the door and lifted the rifle to her shoulder. Leading Darren a bit in her sights, she fired. Blood exploded just right of center on Darren's chest, knocking him back and earning Carrie a savage yowl, audible even over the whirling blades. Turning back, he started running again. Damn it! Working the bolt in one smooth motion, Carrie fired again, striking him just below her first shot and causing him no more distress than had the first. Frantic, Carrie looked down. Parker was leaping and reaching for the rescue harness, but they couldn't pull away yet. Below, Darren was nearly upon them. A bead of sweat ran into Carrie's eye as she lined up for one last shot, the sting of ash causing her to swear and blink. Then, seeing the ash come away as she dashed her fingers over her eye, she acted on wild inspiration. Pulling up and back on the bolt, she withdrew the next round and dragged the icy surface of the Winchester .308 through the ash beneath her eye. "Please work," she prayed as she loaded the round back into the chamber and slammed the bolt home. Darren had reached the shore. As Carrie lowered her eye to the sights, Darren coiled and launched himself at the hovering aircraft. Time seemed to still. Carrie let out a slow, steady breath and fired. Darren's head whipped back as Carrie's round took him between the eyes, and he fell like a stone to the lake shore. Breath held, Carrie leaned out. Darren wasn't moving. He had landed face down with one arm twisted impossibly behind his back, the damage to the back of his skull filling Carrie with a macabre sense of relief as Parker was pulled into the safety of the helicopter. Her world tilted as the chopper angled off toward the city, picking up speed as they left the cold mountain of the Unnamed behind them. But not before Carrie caught a glimpse of Toponi, the fierce Hopi woman, standing on a rise with her blade in the air, tongue rolling in an unheard ululation of victory. Carrie's victory. Epilogue. Carrie slipped off one of her too expensive, too uncomfortable black stilettos that her roommate had convinced her to wear to the awards ceremony. Digging her thumb into the ball of her foot, she groaned, earning a short laugh from Jim as he flopped down next to her, loosening his tie and handing her another glass of champagne. "I still can't believe you went for this," he mused, leaning back in his seat, the massive auditorium now blessedly empty after the Horror Film Festival award ceremony. "Like I said, after everything that happened, the best way to protect the tribe's secret was to bury them in the desensitized ocean of horror fiction. Though I suppose I hadn't expected to win Best Found Footage Film at an international film festival." Carrie had come up with the idea while she was still on the chopper, knowing there was no way she and Jim would be able to keep the entire viewing staff and tech team from talking about the tribe and its sinister duty. She'd instead formulated a plan for a collaborative effort to turn Wild, the wilderness survival series, into Savage, the found footage horror flick about a reality show gone wrong. They'd been able to convince the early contestants of its legitimacy after a healthy payout for their subject-blind participation. And Holly, the only later contestant still alive, knew there had been an emergency that had taken her out of the running early. So she was fed a hybrid story about another contestant having an accident that ended the competition early, and that the footage was actually being used for a different purpose. She had then been awarded her $50,000 for winning the show and signed a release to be featured in the new concept Savage. Nothing is as frightening as the fear of the unknown, Carrie had said to Jim when she'd been trying to sell her point. And the unnamed gains his strength from people's fear. This is how we stop that. And she had been right. Now the terrifying image of the unnamed had been credited to cult-worthy makeup effects, and antler headbands were being sold in the lobby of every movie theater from Cali to New York. Content, Carrie leaned back in her seat. No, thanks to the blatant commercialism of the film industry, no one in the modern world would ever need to fear the legend of the unnamed. Lifting her glass, she tapped it once against Jim's. Then she smiled and took a contented sip. Whew, what an adventure! I don't know about you, but I thoroughly enjoyed that one. Thank you to everyone who took the time to join me here tonight, my maiden voyage into narration, and a huge thank you to the author, Rebecca Johnson. I've listed her information and links to her other work in the description below. She's a new and budding talent, much like myself, so take some time to go check her out and leave her some love. The world could use a little bit more of that just now. And if you can find it in your heart, please subscribe to this channel. I hope to have many more fantastic stories for you to come. Love you most. Good night.